All right, welcome back to Overengineered, the podcast where we ask the question, what's the absolute best way to do things we already have a perfectly acceptable solution for? I am excited. I'm here today with Taylor Otwell. And Taylor, I feel like I have a running bit on the show where I have to say, I can't imagine that anyone who's listening doesn't know who you are, but why don't you do an intro nonetheless? You want to go for it?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. Hey, everybody. I'm Taylor Otwell, the creator of Laravel, a full-stack PHP framework for building modern web applications, which is going on, I guess, about 13 years strong now. Launched it back in 2011.
That's wild. 13 years. It's a long time.
Yeah, it is a very long time in web development scale for sure.
Yes. Yeah, you picked the right language to do a long running thing in.
Yeah, that's true for sure.
I want to say that it's been almost 10 years. That seems long given the fact that Laravel's only 13 years, because I didn't start using Laravel until the 5 dot period, 5.6 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But could it be that it's that long ago? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy running like an open source project this long, because you meet so many people, and then at the same time, like, it's super exciting to see new people come into the ecosystem. You also see people leave the ecosystem to move on. Either they change jobs and their new job uses a different stack. Let's say maybe they're on Python or Go or something, and then they sort of like, are out of the ecosystem. And it's sort of like bittersweet, to see people come and go. But I mean, I think overall it's super exciting, for me, that Laravel all these years later still seems to have sort of these fresh faces coming in to the community and contributing and being excited about it. So I think that's really cool and a little bit unique, for a project this old.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's interesting. I've been the product that I work on, we've been going 20 plus 20, 25 almost years. And so I have a taste for like the long-term maintenance of things, but it's basically just been me the whole time, which has its downsides, right? You don't get that like fresh influx of like ideas or opinions or perspectives, which it also has its ups, right? Like I can just kind of have my opinion always be the right opinion.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's definitely a very like nimble way to work.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, and I mean it's been great in a lot of ways, but I do envy that, like, just getting to be exposed to so many different ways of approaching things.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, well, I was saying before we started recording, like, I think some of the premise of the show doesn't necessarily apply to you because in a lot of ways, building Laravel is going out and finding all the things that could be just a little bit better and making them a little bit better, so you don't have that like backlog of things that you always wish you could take on. So I kind of picked a couple little topics that we might touch on. And the first one I thought might be interesting is just talking about building UIs on the web, specifically with Laravel.
Mm-hmm.
I think that you've been focused a lot on this lately, it seems like, from the outside, with the the release of Volt, and sort of more recently you did send out a tweet about just like this combo of Volt and Folio is a really nice way to work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think from my perspective, we kind of bet on React when we needed to introduce a lot of client-side interaction. And I think for us, that maybe was still the right decision. There's just the React ecosystem is so big that it's let us sort of lean on a lot of existing solutions rather than having to build our own things. But since that decision, the sort of ecosystems outside of that for building these types of UIs have really expanded.
Mm-hmm.
Livewire obviously is doing incredible, and Volt is kind of a nice, nimble way to do Livewire. Alpine, I think, is highly underappreciated as just like a way to do client side UI. And so, yeah, I just wanted to kind of like talk about both practically what the future of building UIs in Laravel looks like, and maybe imagine like what could it look like if we kind of tried to pick the best of everything and set aside all the history. So I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
there's anything in there that sort of sparks your interest to start with.
Yeah, I mean, overall, I would say like chasing the most productive way to build applications in general has always been sort of like the passion of Laravel. And for me personally as well, right? Like, what's the most productive way we can build applications as a whole? And, in the early days of Laravel, the UI wasn't as much a part of that question because I think people were mainly just building like blade rendered, which is basically, if anyone's not familiar with Laravel, basically like server rendered HTML templates using like PHP tags to essentially output data and do loops and all that kind of stuff. So sort of like the equivalent of like ERB templates in Ruby or something. And it just like, I don't feel like it really became a thing to even consider different ways of doing UIs in Laravel until maybe like 2015-ish, 2014-ish, when Angular at the time was actually pretty popular and Vue was really new, and React was, I don't want to say it was new, but it was like complicated, I guess, to use with Laravel. There wasn't like
Yeah.
tools like Inertia and things like that. So over the years, kind of how I've seen this is a lot of these kind of, let's say, quote, full stack JavaScript frameworks that have popped up, like Next.js, Remix, Nuxt, things like that. I feel like they actually have a really great paradigm for building UIs that feels really productive and fast. I don't feel like they have like the full story on the back end as far as like building robust,
We don't
large,
have anything
maintainable
else.
applications. Right. And then conversely, so they're like they're on their journey to figure out what the back end looks like for them right now. I think that's kind of in progress at the moment. And I think conversely for us, we're on a journey to figure out what the front end looks like for us. So we're sort of both working, from opposite directions to figure out the problem space that the other is sort of missing. And I think that Next.js, let's use them as an example, that the whole server actions concept of building UIs and sort of having the server actions and the template in the same file and stuff, I actually think that is a cool idea. And it's a
For
very
sure.
productive way to build UIs. And so when we built Folio and Volt, Folio being sort of our page-based routing system, where you can just like drop a template in your templates directory and then just immediately hit it in your browser using like, folder path URL conventions and stuff. And then Volt, which basically brings that single file component style development to Livewire, was basically inspired by that, directly, that workflow.
Yeah.
And I think it really brings some like really nice ways of working. Some of the stuff that I don't think people talk about enough with Livewire is like the way it lets you punt on some decisions that don't matter, like just defining routes in general. For backend actions, say you have like a save action on a to-do list, and the normal way of building an app using something like Laravel or Rails, you sort of have to build a route, build a controller, all this other stuff. Whereas when you're using Volt, you just you never have to touch the routes file. Just put a function at the top of the component and keep building. And it sort of keeps this very fast development feedback cycle, I think, where you're not having to like
Yeah.
context switch a lot, which I find really productive. I'm not sure like how that actually scales into, let's say, like a Forge size app or a Vapor, for apps I'm familiar with, like the size of those apps and kind of how complicated they can get. I don't
Yeah.
know how that's going to scale. So like when we've tried to build a little bit more complicated things using that stack, we've leaned heavily on like sort of this actions pattern on the back end of like, we have this Livewire action in the top of the component, let's say, but it does like very minimal work. It might just like invoke this other like invocable action class that does the work. And maybe we reuse that same action if we have like an external API or something.
Mm-hmm.
So but yeah, I really like that way of working. But at the same time, sorry, I'm getting kind of long winded before I kind of give you a chance to follow
No,
up
go
here.
ahead.
But so that's one side of the UI story with Laravel, I think, is Livewire as a whole, let's say, and maybe people choose to put Volt on it or not. I think what that side of the story is missing, but I think there's in progress stuff being done on this, is sort of like the UI component library aspect of something like
Hmm.
React, where you have all these rich things like ShadCN or like Tailwind's new Catalyst UI library or Radix primitives, stuff like that, where you can like really lean on all of this work that the ecosystem has done, which I think keeps React popular in this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy kind of way of like, there's so much libraries out there, so everyone kind of builds on a React, which makes even more libraries on a React, and it's sort of like this snowball effect where it's hard to imagine React being sort of like dethroned as the king of kind of JavaScript UI templating because the ecosystem is just so big at this point. But I think that's one point where we're playing catch up a little bit on the Livewire side. And like I said, I know for sure there's things in progress on this. I don't think I can
Sure.
divulge too much because it's not my project, but I'm hopefully we will get to that same sort of like rich component ecosystem. I don't think it will be as big as React's, obviously, but it will be a compelling option, I think. At the same time with Laravel, I love Livewire. I think it's super productive, super fun way to build stuff with Laravel that's light years ahead of like what we had, back 2016, 2015, those days when I was like first really kind of getting Forge out the door. I've never wanted to be, in contrast to someone, let's say like DHH in the Rails ecosystem, I've never wanted to be like all against JavaScript, like,
Hmm.
so tools like Inertia, which let you pair like a React front end or a Vue front end or even a Svelte front end with your Laravel backend in this way that avoids the need for like client side routing. It kind of solves the data hydration story of getting data into the React pages and stuff, and just really simplifies, I think, the whole workflow of working with React and Vue. While I love Livewire, I've always wanted to like really boost that as well because I want people to have options with Laravel, and I think it's kind of silly to like bury your head in the sand a little bit and be like, oh, you can't, there's no productive way to use React with Laravel. You should go all in
Sure.
on, PHP for your templating language. I just don't think that's realistic, and I think it would be bad for the ecosystem. So at the same time, I very much enjoy working with, Inertia, and like we use Inertia to power Forge. So we use Vue on the front end,
Hmm.
Laravel controllers on the back end, and Inertia kind of ties it together. And I think that's a really productive way to work. So I'll kind of stop there, but that's kind of how I see front end, in Laravel right now. I'm pretty bullish on the whole Folio Vault idea, especially if we can add on a pretty sick component library on top of Livewire.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, okay. So that a bunch came up for me, but there are two things that I think really struck me. One is I think I see that this is a theme that keeps on coming up on the show, and I think it's just a theme that keeps on coming up in general. Is I feel like there is a sort of renewal in interest in like how do we rethink code collocation, right? Like this idea of keeping things that belong together, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was a big part of the conversation that I had about modularization. That was a big part of the thinking behind verbs. I think that that's just like that's in the atmosphere right now of just like
Mm.
I think we pushed really hard as a language and sort of things like the PSR standards and composers autoloading really pushed for lots of things separated into many files.
Mm.
And I think that that served us really well, but that people are now starting to feel the pain of like, I have to create 6 different files for each little thing that I want to do, right? And
Mm-hmm.
Livewire, to a degree, has the same issue. It's like you want to create your component, then you need to create your view, and potentially you need to wire that up somehow. And so I can totally appreciate the want to just say, no, all this goes in one place, keep it simple. And I really like that. I like the move in that direction in general,
Yeah.
where it makes sense.
Yeah. I think you're right. And it almost feels like that old mentality of all these separate files sort of was not even unique, I don't think, to PHP, but it really permeated web development as a whole, I would say. And almost like, I feel like PHP and that whole ecosystem almost went through this very like Uncle Bob-esque era of like
Yeah.
tons of files, single responsibility principle taken to like the absolute extreme, you know, where you have command buses and command handlers and all of these hundreds of files that each collectively have, you know, they each maybe have like 15 lines a piece of code, and the
Right.
system feels very fragmented, which may honestly be great for some applications. I'm not really sure, but I do think that people, one, just started to feel the pain of that, and were like, this feels, I'm just constantly switching files constantly, and there's thousands and thousands of files in my project. And then also, I think there's just a move in the wider web development ecosystem that sort of got us out of that era where like code that changes together should live together. And I think it's driven by a few things. Like some of the work in the JavaScript ecosystem, I think, brought in a fresh generation of developers that were, their minds were not tainted by like SRP thinking. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like that, like
Yeah, for
ours
sure.
were, for such an extent, and like they never even heard of it. You know what I mean? It's almost like they have no idea what that means, and it's just like they're looking at the whole problem with fresh eyes in a very pragmatic way, and like what's the best way to work, which I think is really good. And then not even in JavaScript, I mean, even in CSS with like the rise of Tailwind, is sort of like code
Absolutely.
that changes together should live together, taken to the extreme with CSS. And I think it was just like a huge boost to the productivity of so many front end people. Like it literally like enabled me to even be able to build front ends, I think. And you know, at first it's kind of weird because at first like Tailwind looked complicated to me, and then it's like, oh no, the alternative is actually the complicated thing. Tailwind is like the very easy, productive thing to use. You know, like Bootstrap is
Yeah.
actually too complicated for me
Yeah.
to customize. So yeah, and then I think, you know, I feel like we're also getting there in PHP, that there has been sort of like either, you know, the newer people coming into the ecosystem don't have the same baggage and maybe biases of like how things should be built, and they're more willing to sort of experiment with things like Folio and Volt, which I think would be seen as very radical, you know, like 8 or 9 years ago. And there would instantly be sort of like this, no, SRP, this is you know, we need to separate all of these concerns. But I feel like people are kind of more willing to be flexible on that these days, which is good, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think certainly for me, I think that, I had that, I would say not a typical journey with Tailwind of, the first time I saw it, I was just like, oh my God, what is this mess?
Hmm.
But coming to just appreciate just how much better it is to build anything with it made me, did open up my eyes to this idea that, oh, maybe it is possible that we're thinking about things in other places wrong in the same ways.
Hmm.
I definitely think that was a big eye opener for me.
Yeah.
The other thing that you said earlier that I've been thinking about a lot, I I think when Node first came out, I was very excited because the premise of being able to write in one language across the entire stack is just really, really interesting. Because for better or for worse, browsers run JavaScript, right? Browsers don't run PHP. No matter how much we love writing PHP, you know, browsers define what client side code is going to look like. And, maybe WebAssembly changes that a tiny bit, but not that much. And so you're kind of like forced to work backwards from, well, I'm always going to have to write some amount of JavaScript code, probably. So wouldn't it be better to just write all JavaScript code? And I think, maybe there's a world where that becomes a reality. I think that for me, Remix is a really, really interesting approach because it feels like it's really embracing the language, and it's embracing sort of native web features, and making but really doing it in a way that feels productive. But I think all of these frameworks trying to stay away from having opinions about things like, how do you talk to your database? What are you going to do when you need to send an email?
Hmm.
Is just nonsense. It hurts so much because then everyone has to make those decisions over and over and over again, and constantly feel the FOMO of like, oh, well, I picked X, but now I see someone else is using Y, and should we have picked Y? Like, it just
Yeah,
seems like such a nightmare.
it is odd, and I don't know why the ecosystem is that way, because I actually agree. Yes, it would be better if we could just use one language, all the way through the whole stack.
Right.
Whether that's JavaScript or something like Volt and Livewire and stuff, which kind of tries to achieve the same effect of like, hopefully you can mainly write PHP the whole way through. I don't know like why. I don't know why that doesn't exist, for like Next or Remix, like a full, honest to goodness, like back end full stack story. And it was confusing for me for the longest time because like when Remix came out and they said, oh, it's like full stack, I'm thinking, okay, great. Like I'll go out and look at the docs. But I think just what they define as full stack, and I'm not trying to like be negative about the ecosystem, but it's just a lot lighter and more minimal than what we typically would think of as like full stack. So
Yeah.
like, for example, just like the ability to interact with cookies and headers, boom, label full stack, but it's very minimal, almost in like a slim PHP or Silex PHP kind of way.
Right.
We would think
Yeah,
it more
it's
of as like a micro framework.
there. I think that in the JavaScript world, in a lot of ways, full stack just means it can run on the back end.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
It's not necessarily that it actually does the things that you need to do on the back end, talk to cache, talk to database, send email, operate a queue, all of that stuff.
Hmm.
But right now it feels like in the JavaScript world, full stack means we can execute code on the back end.
Yeah.
And it probably is just going to take time. And I know that whenever this conversation comes up, like Adonis is brought up, which is
Hmm.
kind of a remarkable clone of Laravel for JavaScript.
Right.
But I think, and I may get some pushback on this, but like, I think that the problem with an approach like Adonis is it's trying to port a fundamentally different like way of approaching things to JavaScript, right?
Mm.
JavaScript needs to operate differently because it's a totally different language. It has different paradigms. And I think ideally an approach like Remix that's really embracing what's great about JavaScript feels like the long-term winner, but it's just like they need to solve so many more problems before it's viable for most people.
Yeah, I think that's true. And like, I'm not going to lie, I've been tempted to jump in there and try to solve those kind of problems in that space, or like assign someone on our team to like this Area 51 style project where we try to,
Yeah.
basically port a lot of our server libraries. So I think you're right that it wouldn't look like Adonis, but like, could we build like a server kit for something like Remix or Next, where you can use a lot of the Laravel style stuff, but sort of maintained their fundamental ways of working with, the request response cycle in Remix or Next. So, I mean, I've definitely been tempted to do it. I saw someone tweet a couple months ago, like a screenshot of Nova, and this was a JavaScript ecosystem person, and they were like, we're so far away from this in JavaScript, and we don't even understand like how far away from being able to have something like this that we are. And I mean, I think it's true. It is a daunting task. There's a lot to build to really flesh out that whole story, both just all of the stuff that's kind of generally in the Laravel core framework, but then also all the packages, like even stuff like Horizon and Telescope and Nova and Cashier. And it just gets like really overwhelming really quickly, the amount of stuff that
Yeah.
really would need to be ported.
Yeah. I mean, you've got 13 years of stuff
Yeah.
that and obviously a lot of that time is spent learning lessons that you don't have to learn again. But
Hmm.
there's also just a lot of code that got written over those 13 years that you'd have to figure out how to reimagine.
Hmm. I do think that one thing that has changed, I'm curious your thinking on that. When I first started writing PHP was a very natural entry point language for people into web programming. There were
Yeah.
still a lot of people first coming into web development were coming in through PHP more often than not, it seemed like. Whereas I don't think that's the case now. Most people coming into web development, whether it's through like some sort of boot camp or whatever, they're being introduced to these types of JavaScript tools. And their idea of the back end is like, oh, that's just something I make an API call to. Like someone else, some other nerd, like writes that back
Mhm.
end. And I just like call the endpoint they tell me to call. And this is the data I expect to get back. So I feel like you have a whole fresh generation of programmers coming into the ecosystem. And I think Adam Wathan from Tailwind tweeted about this once where like it feels like a lot of them actually don't know what an SQL query is or like even like really how databases work. And is that a problem or not? I don't know. Like I think maybe the Vercel CEO responded like, why should they know like how an SQL query works? Like that's good. It's good. Like we should abstract all of that away actually. So I don't know what the right answer is, but I do know that web development has changed in terms of how people come into the top of the funnel of web development and sort of what they know at the outset. Whereas, you know, 14, 15 years ago when they were coming in through either PHP or Ruby on Rails, everyone knew what a database query was. They probably knew like how to set up a table, and how to query it and stuff like that. And now that feels like not the case. And that's a pretty big shift. It's a big shift for us at Laravel that I think about a lot in terms of like we're fighting a different battle in terms of getting new people into the ecosystem. And I think, trying to build things like Folio and Volt and different ways of building UIs is sort of like us trying to build bridges that are familiar to people that are in other ecosystems where it's like, okay, if I see a Volt component, it looks pretty different actually than React, but there's some similarities, that I can kind of like map concepts to,
Yeah.
whether I can attach this function to a button click and this runs on the server, so it is somewhat familiar. So we are trying to build bridges there, as the ecosystem changes as a whole.
Yeah, I think that is really interesting. I hadn't necessarily thought about it in that framing before, because you're absolutely right. I mean, when I got into web development, it basically was PHP. PHP and MySQL were your options as sort of like an indie. Like if there are other ways to build for the web, but it was just kind of like overwhelmingly obvious that if you were a small company and you wanted to build, that was the stack, right? Like that was your
Mm-hmm.
option. And you're absolutely right that most people getting into the industry now are not having that experience and trying to
Mm-hmm.
figure out a way to meet them differently makes a lot of sense. And I think, I don't know, that okay, that kind of brings me to this thought that I've been having a lot. Now, I want to preface this with I don't use Livewire. I haven't used Volt. I've played with both of them, but I don't have a lot of like personal experience, so it's more coming from the hypothetical perspective. We still almost exclusively do Blade and Alpine. Almost everything that we need, a straight server rendered page with a little bit of client side interaction is plenty good. And if we need something really sophisticated, then we will just build a React app for that piece. So yeah, this is kind of like theory crafting more than anything else. But when I saw the first announcement of Volt, my initial reaction was like, this feels really good and I feel like it could go even further, right? That
Mm.
like I kind of wish that there was a world where you don't even need to drop like PHP tags at the top of the page.
Mm.
And so this is great podcast content. I'm going to talk about a screenshot that I sent you that the listener can't see, but I sent you a little snippet, and I'll just describe it briefly. And I'm curious what your thought is, your reaction.
Hmm.
You know, I can't say enough about using Alpine on the client side, and I just love the fact that I can encapsulate a nice chunk of interaction into just like a single, set of HTML tags. I just drop like X data on a div, and all of a sudden, like that div is got the like Alpine superpowers. And, we're already parsing the, pre-processing the HTML in Blade templates. Why couldn't we go a step further and bring a lot of that Livewire stuff into, so that it felt like it was part of the DOM from like the authoring perspective, and in the end, like it would do the same exact thing as Volt. It would get extracted into a component. All those like directives that are sort of server only would just get stripped from the output. Does something like that appeal to you at all? Like trying to, almost get to a point where Blade feels a lot like JSX, except that instead of like JavaScript expressions inside of attributes, you write PHP expressions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does appeal to me. Like, I'm interested in all these sort of experimental ways of building front ends in PHP, and it doesn't only appeal to me like these sorts of pre-processed, really experimental approaches. It doesn't only appeal to me in the Livewire sense. Like, I've also thought about it for like inertia, where I want to be able to put the server side of inertia stuff in my inertia components too, like in the React with the React templates, and
Mm.
strip out all the server stuff, compile the front end templates, the normal way, and all of that. So yeah, I think there are definitely ways to take it even further on both sides of the coin. That I think we'll continue to explore, as we have time and resources. But I think you're right. I don't think the story is like finished. I think there's further to go, and it's crazy how fast things change, like at the same time, like React and these sorts of remix and next style frameworks seem like, oh, well, this is like the final boss of like how UIs are built in JavaScript. And it's kind of crazy to think now, like the ways people built SPAs just a few years ago almost feel like dead, like a thing of
Yeah,
the past,
archaic. Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like I spent so much time at Laravel thinking like, okay, how do we play nice with SPAs? And now SPAs are totally freaking dead, and
Right.
it's just crazy. So as much as I think like I know what the current thing is going to be, like I just seem to it just changes in ways I don't expect. But I think you see that even a little bit already with even things like the current, popular JavaScript frameworks, where you start to see sort of like hype building around things like HTMX, for example, of
Yeah.
like maybe people are kind of getting sick of the churn of the JavaScript ecosystem and the new hot thing changing so frequently, and I know when I've talked to people that are in Silicon Valley, and they're really interested in Laravel, or they find it compelling. I've actually asked them directly, aren't you like concerned that it's PHP? Like, doesn't that bother you? And they're like, actually, no. Like, we crave like the stability of this ecosystem in a way you
Yeah.
don't understand, because we're tired of everything changing every 5 minutes.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a lot of burnout. And, I think there's something exciting about, the sort of interesting, fast-paced experimentation of
Hmm.
new approaches. But I think that, and it has a place, but it definitely, for companies that especially want to like deliver a real product and like continue to deliver that product and like improve the product, not
Mhm.
constantly improve their like build process.
Yeah. Yeah, we've tried to
It
maintain a
only goes so
balance
far.
of that because I think you're right. Like, if you don't have that sort of experimental vibe in your ecosystem, it starts to feel stale, right? I mean, people start
Yes.
to be like, "Is this thing maintained? Is this dead?" Blah blah blah. It just doesn't feel interesting or exciting anymore. And that's part of why we built things like Folio and Volt, and even Laravel 11 as a whole. Is sort of part of this experiment to build bridges with other ecosystems. Let's strip away a lot of the cruft. Let's look at the framework with fresh eyes. Do we really need all of these kernel files in the framework? Do we really need all of these middleware files in the framework? So how can we make it feel more approachable, less overwhelming, a little bit more fresh, for the next generation of developers, So it's something we still think about a lot. And I think we try to strike that balance of having fun experimental things and trying new things while also kind of maintaining this core of stability where the overall foundational concepts of how we build apps is not changing every couple weeks.
Right. Yeah. It's nice. I mean, I definitely I don't envy having to figure that out because it is a really hard line to draw, because you are really sort of playing to two very, very different needs at the same time, right? Like the stability and the ease of upgrade and just like, Laravel 11's amazing from my perspective. Our app is very large and upgrading Laravel has never been the pain point, Maybe
Hmm.
there are a couple of packages that are a bit of a pain to upgrade from time to time, or there are other places where we have to like do some work, but usually the Laravel upgrade, and I think I got lucky in that, I know that the transition from like the early versions up through Laravel 5 was a little bit more of a big shift because like you were still kind of finding the what felt right.
Hmm.
But yeah, like that is incredible. And at the same time, it's like, yeah, it's fun to have new shiny things, like I don't think
Hmm.
there's anything wrong with that either of just like, a lot of people get into programming because it's a job, but a lot of people get into programming because they love to do it. And there's something about just like having fun with it and trying new things and experimentation that really makes that appeal.
Hmm. Yeah, I think so too.
Is there anything so like are there any ideas that you have for sort of taking that like taking the next step with Blade or with Folio, like experiments that you want to play around with or syntax that you want to try out, or is it kind of like you just want to feel what this current moment feels like and take it from there?
I would like to. So I have some ideas of things I want to build just to try out that architecture as a whole in a more real world way. Because, to be transparent, like Forge is not built with Volt and Folio. I would like to actually build a real app using this approach to really help me suss out like what is good and bad about it so that I have real world, data on it. I think I would be hesitant to push too far in like an experimental direction right now without doing that because I would really be kind of building in the dark. And I personally like everything I build to be sort of born out of like a real problem I've actually surfaced in reality and not sort of like
Mhm.
guessing at the problem. So I think I'll probably do that, and I have kind of some fun projects in mind I like to build that are not too big where it's like it's going to be a huge waste of time, but they're not totally trivial also that I think will help, kind of feel out what the weak spots are as far as like core syntax and parsing stuff goes. I mean, we've been working on some kind of basic stuff, like just trying to improve the performance of that whole stack. I tweeted out last week that, one thing that's always bothered me about like the Folio Volt story is all of these components have to be rendered on the server versus sort of shoving off, you know, every little button component that needs to be rendered your PHP servers parsing that. We have to new up like this component instance. All the HTML has to get rendered versus shoving that off on the client. So we actually did make like a 20% performance improvement. Christopher Pitt, who's been around the Laravel ecosystem a while, and another contributor named Lonnie Lott came up with a few ways to squeeze out like a 20% performance improvement. There's probably more we can do there. I've been focusing on the speed of that stack a little bit, but again, I think I'll try to build some real world things before I like get really experimental with it.
I saw that tweet. That's incredible. I didn't get a chance to look at it. Is that an improvement on the compilation side or on the rendering side?
It's more like at the runtime rendering side.
Mm-hmm.
So like just being able to kind of memoizing some stuff that we were invoking a lot, caching off some stuff that we were invoking a lot, not dispatching the view composer and view creator events if there's no composers listening for those components, because that took up quite a bit of time actually. So just kind of some basic like caching memoization stuff. Like a lot of people want to jump right to the kind of the file IO side on the performance stuff, but opcache in PHP sort of negates a lot of those penalties, so you don't really have to worry about that much. So I feel like we've kind of squeezed all the juice out of that we can. Probably most of the remaining improvements are actually very like micro optimizations as far as the kind of stuff we've been doing so far.
Yeah, I mean, I think I asked that just because it feels to me like, I would rather see Blade get more powerful and slower to compile, because that, you compile a Blade template to PHP once and then you're fine, right? So I can see a world where the Blade compilation step becomes much more sophisticated. I know there's kind of an incredible, I don't know if you've seen it, and I'm blanking out on his name right now, but there's an incredible, Blade implementation that's like a full like tokenizer, like parser that someone built. And, I can see potentially exploring that side of things, making the compilation process like more extensible at like a really like granular level, because right now it's either you're like, okay, I'm running my own regular expressions before Blade gets to it, or I'm kind of like pumping out PHP syntax, when Blade lets me.
Yeah.
And for the most part, that's
almost want to
fine.
make Blade a real language. Sounds like it's kind
Right.
of which it's not right now. It's kind of more of just like a regular expression based templating replacement system or something.
Yeah, but I mean, I can't believe we didn't talk about it yet. Like when Blade components, came first party. I mean, I think that was one of the biggest improvements to like the Laravel UI development experience that we've had, that I saw. Just that Blade component syntax is just so much nicer to work with in so many different scenarios. And like, yeah.
I am surprised we didn't mention that first, but yeah, like that obviously was like kind of the first huge leap forward for Blade, developing UIs in Blade. That was originally developed by Spotsy, the agency, and then of course, ported into Laravel. I don't know how long it's been now. I kind of take it for granted, which is why it didn't even come to mind as like the stepping stone. But yeah, that was a huge leap forward that enabled so many better use cases for building applications with Blade.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's like that I keep on trying to talk about this with people, and I haven't found a way to articulate sort of like the itch that I'm trying to scratch, but it's somewhere in the realm of like feeling how good it is to work with Blade components. And then on the flip side, sort of feeling how good it is to work with Alpine, like, excuse me, these just like attributes that you drop on on your HTML tags, and they just like do amazing things. I mean, the drag and drop stuff that Caleb just came out with is incredible. Like, talk about taking something that is so hard to get right and abstract it away into just like, oh, X draggable or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
And I think just it feels to me like there's a world where those two things come together in like a new way, where sort of the line between what a blade component is and what a Livewire component is and what an Alpine component is gets even blurrier in a good way.
Yeah.
And I still don't know what it looks like, but it's something that I just like ponder from time to time.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. And that's partially why, like, I sort of reached out to Caleb and said, hey, let's kind of make Livewire. You keep maintaining it and running the show, but let's make it feel like this first party part of the Laravel ecosystem, because I think it's going to continue to be such an integral part of how people could potentially build UIs with Laravel. Because I think you're right. I mean, there's something pretty magical about the whole Alpine blade and potentially Livewire combination that I wanted to sort of like get ahead of it and be like, hey, let's kind of like bake this into the story a little bit and make this feel like this is what Blade should have been from the beginning. Like this is how it should have
Yeah.
felt. Is this really robust, powerful way to build UIs?
Yeah. Yeah, it's an exciting time, I think, in general. Like it's really interesting to see. I mean, I feel like I see talk about FOMO. I definitely feel like I see so many interesting things in the like Livewire and lots of people posting about filament and like
Mm-hmm.
all these different approaches that are like, I want to have that too.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I haven't even tried filament yet, which I know a lot of people love. And I get asked my opinions on a lot, but it's just like I always have to be like, haven't had time to like even compose or install it, and give it a whirl. But definitely seems to be a pretty popular thing for an even higher level of abstraction, as far as
Right.
like, let me just drop a data table or drop whatever onto a chart onto my app.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it feels like filament a little bit is a little bit like what you were talking about at the beginning of sort of offering that component library feel. I do think that it feels like it feels a little bit more all or nothing to me. I know that's not entirely true, but it kind of feels like you have to buy into the filament way. Whereas I
Mm,
can see a world. I mean, one of the nice things about component libraries in the JavaScript world is just like, yeah, I can just grab headless UI, or I can just grab like this, the React select component and just kind of like drop it into my app. And it doesn't really impact the rest of the way that I approach things. And
mm,
I definitely think that there's a world, and I know that Caleb has talked publicly about, working on something in that space.
mm-hmm.
I think there's a world where there's something in between, right? That's like giving you those really rich interactions and a lot of the, figuring out a lot of the hard parts for you, but doesn't necessarily take over the way you build. It's just like, this is a really great component to drop here. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Interesting. I This is something I can't remember who I was talking about. I think I talked about this on the podcast, but I can't remember who. When I first got into Laravel, like I said, I think it was 5.6, and whatever it was, I guess it was the first release that came out after the HTML and form builder stuff was pulled out of the framework.
Mm, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I remember just coming in and thinking like, how is it possible that this framework has absolutely everything under the sun, but doesn't have a solution to building forms, just because form building is like such a central part of like every web application, you know?
Yeah,
And
it is true. Like every web framework had something for that, you know?
right. And I wonder, I don't really know. I've never actually talked to anyone. I don't know if you remember like what was the backstory behind the decision to pull it out at that time? Do you know? Do you remember?
I think it's like it was a hard thing to build in a way that pleased everyone, because everyone
Mm-hmm.
had a lot of opinions on how a form builder should work. And I still think there's like something to this. I mean, so much of what we do is building forms, right? You know,
Yeah.
as web developers. These are still discussions I've had with people recently of like, hey, how do we make the form story better? This was in an inertia context, but it just goes to show that like forms is still something top of mind, you know, like in the Laravel world. But you know, I think back to your question, it was just like it was such a hard thing to build, and it was such like I kind of think of this as the framework can easily develop these PR black holes that seem to attract PRs forever, and I try to avoid them. So I'm trying to think of other examples of this, but forms was definitely one of them. Oh, and another weird version of this is the key generate command in Artisan, which seems to just attract PRs, and you would not expect it to,
Interesting.
but it does, to the point where I literally I feel bad doing this, but I've literally had to be like, I'm no longer accepting PRs on this command. You know, like this is a finished command. But anyway,
That is
forms is just like
wild.
another one of those things where it's like there is this constant PRs of like, I think it should work this way or that way, blah, blah, blah. And eventually it got to the point of like, hey, like this is actually not a very complicated thing to build on your own, like a simple form builder that just outputs HTML tags. Why don't we just sort of
Mhm.
like divest ourselves of this responsibility and turn this over to the community to like, we're turning it over to the free market, you know, to build form library component builders or whatever. You know, that being said, I don't know, like if there's a space to revisit that now that so much has changed as far as how people
Yeah.
build front ends with Laravel, whether it be with Livewire or Inertia. Maybe there is room to come back and say, like, maybe there's an opinionated way to build forms that feels really productive and good and fresh. But yeah, that was my thinking at the time. Was it turned into one of those PR black holes that was just like kind of a maintenance burden and time sink that I didn't really
Yeah.
want to think about anymore.
No, I can appreciate that. Yeah. I mean, I realized that maybe not the last episode, but a couple episodes ago I had Adam on to talk about Catalyst,
Hmm.
and we talked a lot about form building because you know, that was the first big package that I released was like a Laravel form builder because I just was like, we need this. We're going to use it everywhere. Might as well open source it. And I've you know, it's been it's been fairly well received, but I was kind of surprised at how little interest there was in that space. And I
Hmm.
think that part of it feels like to me is that the front end story is so sort of fragmented that it's not there's not like one right way. You know, like the form
Hmm.
building needs if you're doing purely like server rendered HTML are just so fundamentally different than if you're doing, you know, Vue and inertia or React and inertia. And that's going to be very different than if you're doing Livewire. And so it's like, it kind of doesn't make sense. I think I'm realizing that more and more just this like the just blade and alpine approach is just not the default for a lot of people.
Hmm.
And so solutions that really just target that are getting more niche, you know, there it's not,
Hmm.
even though obviously lots and lots of really fantastic Laravel apps are still just built mostly with Blade. You know, there are just so many different ways to approach things that something like form building where the types of decisions and types of APIs that you're going to need are just so different across those
Yeah.
systems. I can just see it be hard to find a like universal approach.
Yeah, I think you're right that probably the solution will have to be tailored to each ecosystem. I think it's interesting that even in sort of like the hot and trending ecosystems like Remix, which we brought up a few times, Forms is apparently still very top of mind to them as well. Like I think when Remix came out, one of their big points of emphasis was like, hey, look, we could sort of have this form component as like this first class primitive and like all of these niceties around working with forms, because this is so like fundamental to how web applications are built. Even all the way here in 2024, we're still spending a lot of time building forms. So I definitely think there's a story there, and yeah, probably the solution is going to have to be tailored to each ecosystem. So I'd be curious to see what the best way to do that in each ecosystem, or each, not ecosystem, but each sort of like paradigm of building web UIs,
Yeah.
what that will look like.
Well, and it feels like things like precognition are
Mm,
kind of like that is a relatively universal solution to like one specific problem that forms have. And yeah, you need kind of like different drivers for Vue and
mm-hmm.
React and Livewire, but fundamentally it's like picking out that like one slice, the validation slice. And I can imagine that maybe there are other solutions like that just like, pull out one piece and make that one piece a little bit easier. Although, how many more slices are there? Validation and
Yeah, well, I mean,
like sort of
something that came up recently with Adam and I were talking as we were playing Fortnite. Actually, we were talking about better ways to do optimistic UIs in inertia, where
mhm.
if you're building an inertia page and you have a form submission, it tries to behave sort of like a typical Blade form submission, where the form totally finishes submitting, you get redirected back to the page, you show some success message, which is great. That's like a really streamlined, productive way to work. But if you wanted to do like an optimistic UI in inertia, right now you're sort of forced to drop down to kind of the old school way of doing things, where maybe you make some like fetch request to the back end, you immediately update, let's say, like the to-do list in your front end to add the new to-do item. And then, if there's an error, you show that later. But being able to build almost like a remix style form component for inertia that lets you do traditional form submissions and redirects the typical way you would do with either Blade or inertia, honestly, or lets you kind of have these nice hooks into optimistic UIs, I think would be an interesting thing that honestly we may explore building something like that here at Laravel as we're working on some of these new products we're building this year. It'll be a good opportunity to sort of explore the forum story, because we're going to be building a lot of forums this year. So we'll have a lot of like dog fooding we can do to try to build nice experiences.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a funny sort of challenge. There's like the adage, it's all tables and forms basically,
Hmm.
and it's like data tables and form components like have such a could have such a high impact, but also, yeah,
Totally.
like you said, it's so opinionated, and
Hmm.
how just all the different decisions that go into how you want it to be rendered, how you want the interactions to work. Like I can see it being almost impossible to like land on one solution that, meets enough needs to be
Yeah.
satisfying.
I think you're right though, that like if you do land on a good solution, it's so high impact, as far as, and those are the things I love to work on the most, is like almost every Laravel developer is going to have their productivity improved by a solution in that space, because everyone's writing forms. And I would love to, get some hard data. You made a comment about there's still a lot of apps built just using Blade, not using Livewire, not using Inertia, just old school way of building apps. And I would love to get some hard data of like, something we did recently for Forge is like literally to send out a survey, the good old fashioned way, about like, what are you using Forge for? What kinds of applications are you building? Like how important is it in your sort of hosting story? But the same for like sort of on the open source side of like, what are you using to build the front end on the front end? What pain points are you having? I would love to get more hard data there because it's very easy, I think, for a lot of us that are, which goes for me, is people that are online a lot or on Twitter a lot. It's very easy to make assumptions about what people are doing, and they're often
Yeah.
very, very wrong and very, very like
Yes.
different from reality. I think reality tends to like lag pretty far behind a lot of these trends, as far as what people are actually working on the ground. There's definitely these people using these cutting edge tools and building with all of the latest stuff. But I think for a lot of people, that's just not the reality. So yeah, it would be interesting to get more hard data there on kind of what people are using and maybe help us steer us for like what problems should we be solving first.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder. I mean, this is a really fine line as well. But like, would you ever consider like having some sort of, opt-in package that people could install that like is just like a composer post install hook that's like, these are the packages that I have installed. And you could just like offer that within the Laravel installer. Like, would you be willing to tell
Yeah,
us what packages you
an,
have installed?
kind of anonymous
Yeah.
usage data. I would honestly love something like that, to be honest. And this has come up so much of like, it's so hard for us to know who is using Laravel and what are they using it for.
Yeah.
We just recently put Clearbit on the Laravel website to try to suss out some of that as far as like what company logos are actually visiting the Laravel website. Like, for example, if we see that, I don't know, Wells Fargo, let's say, for example, is on the Laravel installation docs or on the routing docs a lot, that's really great info for us to have, and like we've always struggled
Yeah.
to know like who is using Laravel and in what capacity. So I think that's actually a really interesting idea of like that kind of a prompt after you run Laravel new of like, would you mind sending some anonymous usage data? I'm sure people see this with software all the time. That would be super helpful actually of like, what package are you using? How are you, we could probably suss out some pretty interesting data if we did that.
Yeah. I mean, or even like for a little while, I put up I put up a website. It was Spotsy.cards. I was feeling bad about never sending Spotsy the postcards that I was supposed to send them, so I built a whole little web app that you basically could just pick from a drop down of a Spotsy package, and pick your hometown, and it would like auto generate a postcard and send it for you.
Mm-hmm.
And I always wanted, but never actually got to the point of, I really wanted to make. I was gonna do like a JavaScript package so that you could just do like npx. That would just be like npx Spotsy cards or whatever, and have it
Mm-hmm.
look at the current composer.json file and then like basically either pick one of the packages at random or let you pick from like a list from there, so that it was kind of like, hey, it's going to be built based off of the actual app that you use. And I could see even just doing something that like that, like
Mm-hmm.
just a simple little command line utility that anyone could run at any time that just like uploads just the list of packages installed in your current composer.json file,
Yeah.
Because I imagine that if you posted on Twitter, like, hey, do you mind running this command? Like, you'd probably
Mm-hmm.
get a decent return on just that at first,
Yeah, I think it's a good idea, honestly.
And it wouldn't, I
May
mean, it would
explore
be,
that.
yeah, it would be pretty simple to build,
Yeah.
And the cool thing is, yeah, if it was a node package, then people could just run it without even having to install anything, which
Hmm.
I would love to see that happen in Composer as well. That'd be pretty cool to have a Composer version of npx.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely.
Well, we had a bunch of other things that I thought maybe we'd get to. We are at an hour. If there's anything on that list that interests you, I'm happy to talk about it, but I also don't want to take up too much of your time. So if you think this is a good place to call it, I'm happy to do that as well.
Well, if we were going to do like 5 or 10 bonus minutes, what would be the most interesting thing that we didn't cover that you would want to cover?
Well, okay. I think the one topic that came up on a previous episode was I sat down with Caleb and talked about lifecycle hooks.
Mm,
Basically Livewire has a bunch of systems in place to like hook into different moments that the mount and mounting and mounted and boot and all that stuff.
right.
And he's really built a pretty robust system around that. And we talked about hooks in reaction in relation to like WordPress, right? How hooks are kind of like the blessing and curse of WordPress, right?
Mm,
Part of what makes working with WordPress so awful is that everything is a hook, but also I think arguably part of what made WordPress so successful was you could hook into literally everything, and so anything was possible.
hmm
And I think the thing that I keep on coming back to is I feel like there's an opportunity in Laravel to have some sort of single approach to hooks that both would be available at the framework level, but also then would standardize the way other packages could do it.
hmm
And the example would be, you know, new context stuff when you register a closure to add context, or when you register a closure to add data to all job payloads, or
hmm
the stuff that happens within the testing to like automatically execute traits, or the stuff that happens on the model around you know registering event lifecycle hooks on models.
Yeah.
I feel like there's an opportunity to sort of unify that under one single API that then would mean that all that stuff is done in just one way in the framework. But I think what's even more interesting is all of that stuff. Then there would be a single paradigm that any package maintainer could also lean on, so that we don't have to all reinvent the wheel. Have you ever
Yeah.
thought about that?
No, I haven't, but I've felt that pain because like even like some of the recent stuff you referred to about like the context stuff, for example. So anytime we sort of reinvent that hook system, I actually have had to go step back and be like, okay, I know we do this other parts of the framework. What do those method signatures look like? What order are the arguments in, so that I can make sure that like it feels semi-consistent with how we do that kind of thing in other places. So no, it hasn't crossed my mind, but it probably should have. And I wonder, like, are you picturing almost like one, let's just say facade for like ease of discussion, but like one facade where you can like tap into all of those different types of hooks, so that there's sort of like one unified system for registering hooks across those different packages, and then other people could sort of tap into that system.
Kind of what we landed on, and I have like a proof of concept that we're using internally at Internetchi now, is sort of like a hookable trait,
Mm,
because I think you still want to interact with the specific components that you're hooking into. I don't think
hmm
sort of like a global hook facade makes a lot of sense. And I think but I think like essentially being able to just pull in sort of like hookable into any class and be able to expose, you know, essentially the same sort of set of APIs makes a lot of sense. And I just think like, I've noticed over the years, right, the like Laravel hooks have moved from, okay, you can register a single closure that like is the thing that is in charge of doing this, to the more modern approach is like each closure that you register augments like and merges in new data. And so
hmm
like just being able to unify that take on everything.
Mm.
And yeah, just having each one sort of feel the same way. And then realistically, you'd probably still end up exposing like nicely named functions for like the common use cases, because
Mm.
probably you still want like you know, queue make payloads using, because that feels good. But under the hood, it would just call the same APIs as everywhere else. And if you needed to access more, yeah, I think that there's something really interesting there.
Yeah, that could be cool. You'll just show me some of the proof of concepts or like some of that hookable trait ideas you've had. But yeah,
Yeah,
because I have felt that pain point, but it just never crossed my mind for some reason to try to like step back and unify it a little bit. But that would be pretty sweet, actually. It reminds me a little bit like this is a little bit different, but I don't know if you saw this is old. But there used to be like a PECL PHP extension called like aspect oriented programming for PHP where you could do like you could literally hook in before any method or after any method or
yes.
around method. It was truly some magical type stuff. Anyway, it kind of I don't it looks like it made me go out here and look at it. It looks like it hasn't been updated in 10 years actually. But yeah, pretty wild stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a hard, I mean, like I said, uh, you know, the risk is the worst parts of working with WordPress are also the hook system, right? So
Yeah.
it's
Is it
like
sort of
it's a
do you
really
think the main
tricky balance.
problem is like the hiding of behavior? Because that's sort of like
Yeah.
it's a little bit of a similar problem I see sometimes with just events in general is like it can become difficult to know where all these things are happening because the behavior is very separate. I mean, it ties all the way back to the beginning of the discussion where like the behavior is very in a very different place than where
Yes.
things are happening.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
things can become very spread out. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, yes, that is the biggest concern. And so I think it would have to be something that's like, you use it very carefully, right? You
Hmm.
don't just like throw hooks on everything just because you can. And
Yeah.
and I think, I don't know, my thoughts on sort of the evented stuff is just like, as a team you have to pick the paradigm that you're comfortable with. And I
Hmm.
think the worst case scenario is when, you have an application that has 3 observers
Hmm.
and everything else is done in a totally different way. So that like
Yeah.
every once in a while you run into something and you can't for the life of you figure out why it's not working, and it's because, oh, this is the one thing that we implemented through events, right?
Mm.
Because if everything's implemented in an evented way, then it's fine, you just always know where to look. But
Hmm.
yeah,
And
it's
I do
like
think
when
with
you
this hook system, we probably have like the conventions in place to handle that because I know like when I bring up a new Laravel app, the first thing I do is a lot of times just pop open the app service provider so I can kind of see like what customizations have sort of been made to this app. Like I
Mhm.
think probably that's where some of that hook stuff gets done, is in these
Yeah,
service provider boot methods. So I mean,
yeah,
probably it would become pretty conventional, I think, to configure that stuff there. I know that's where I always look first to see sort of that kind of
yeah.
thing.
No, I think, that is a good point, that it's like there is sort of a central place where that stuff happens. Yeah. I
Hmm.
mean, and I'm happy to show it to you. The other really interesting thing that we've done with hooks that I didn't originally envision, but actually I think is like one of the more exciting pieces, is we also implemented view hooks.
Hmm.
So basically inside of Vue, you can just like do X hook and give it a name and potentially pass it arguments, and the slot is like the default view for that hook if there aren't any hooks there. But in like really complicated UIs where there's like a ton of conditional logic, being able to, again, kind of going back to that collocation thing, the logic that determines what customizations have to happen at the view layer and the logic that actually implements those customizations all happens in one place. And so we
Hmm.
have like a single service provider that maybe handles, like in our case, we deal with a lot of like state licensing issues. So it's like, okay, this state requires that we include a certain message in like the outgoing email if like a person is licensed in that state. They also require that like we have them collect one additional piece of info when they're taking an exam, and they require that we like show some sort of like identity confirmation dialogue at some random moment in the exam. Like this is real stuff that the states have asked us, right? And
Hmm.
so before, that code was like peppered throughout the entire code base. Now, in those three hookable places in the UI, we just have like an X hook tag. And now all the logic related to that, like states licensing requirements, lives in one place. And it's just like reaching into those different locations. And it's another one of those things where there is some indirection, and it comes with a cost. I wouldn't recommend it for like just like a starting point for how you're going to build your UI. But when you get into more complicated conditional rendering, it's been a really, really useful tool for us. It's kind of amazing how powerful that can be.
Wow. Yeah. That sounds pretty sweet, actually. I have to check that out as well.
Yeah. Well, this has been really fun. Maybe we'll do a redux with this other list
Yeah.
at some point. I've had a good time, but thanks for taking the time. Is there any last thoughts, last words, or anything you want to plug at the end here before we call it quits?
No, nothing too much, yeah, it was fun. Thanks for having me on. We are hiring, that'd be the only thing I would plug would be like laravel.com/careers. If you're interested in coming on board at Laravel and helping us think through sort of like the next set of problems we're trying to tackle, submit your resume.
What are the jobs that you're hiring for right now?
Yeah, so we're hiring full stack developers, kind of your typical Laravel developers. We're hiring infrastructure people, so people that maybe have experience with cloud stuff, Kubernetes, hosting, web applications in general. I think that kind of stuff. We're also hiring a designer. We've never had a full-time designer at Laravel to help us build. Actually, what should these buttons look like? What should this form
Yeah,
look like? That kind of thing. We're hiring product managers, probably a couple. Never had a product manager at Laravel to help us kind of take a holistic view of managing, something like Forge or Vapor or something like that. And then tech support, which support for us is pretty tricky because it ends up being pretty technical stuff that we're having to debug for the customers. So a lot of times our customer support people need, some light experience, either managing Nginx or MySQL or something like that. So
for sure.
yeah, so I think it's like 5 different positions we have up on the website right now.
Okay, awesome. And that it's laravel.com/careers.
Yep.
Sweet. All right. Well,
Yep.
thanks again for hanging out. It's been fun.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. See you.